This section of the presentation focuses on assessment alignment. If you haven't already done so, you'll want to download and print out the booklet that focuses on the kindergarten entry phase 2 for Guilford County Schools. It's on the same page where you found this presentation. Within that booklet, there is a handout for this section of the presentation, and it contains a chart where you'll want to take some notes. So let's begin. So what formative data do you already gather that you can use? Well, there are a couple of Unit 1 ELA tasks that I think will be fairly helpful to you. A couple of them are not graded tasks. One is around foundations, or another program or letter identification, sound and knowledge, letter formation that you may be using at your school, that you use with your kindergarten students. And there's a task rubric that you use to gather letter and sound knowledge around your students. Well, this aligns very nicely with the letter naming progression. And also, as students are engaged in letter formation, you can be observing for fine motor, grip and manipulation, and hand dominance. So these observations can be pictures, notes, or oral accounts that you match to the progressions to interpret and adapt your instruction. So you're already gathering this data and you can use it to then inform your instruction. So what does that look like? This is just a piece of the construct progression. The full progressions are also on that Guilford specific page of the regional wiki, but this just gives you an idea. Suppose that on your checklist, you notice that you have a student or several students that can accurately select and name the letters in their own name, or some to all of the letters in their own name. So you have that data and you've got it on your checklist. And so what are your next steps? The construct progressions are meant to inform your instruction. So it's I have the data. I'm required to gather this data by Guilford County Schools. So what do I do next with the data? That's the purpose of the construct progressions for the kindergarten entry assessment. It's meant to inform your instruction and help you adapt and best meet the needs of your students. So suppose you have students that can accurately name some to all of their letters. Find where they would be along that progression. What this does is it helps you to discover what their learning target would be. So if you know where they are, that's what we call their current learning status. So their current learning status, you've probably identified, is step E along this progression. So then their learning target, that next step, where we would guide them next, would be step F. They accurately select letters when given the letter name. So if I know where they are and where they need to go next, then that can help me to guide their instruction and their learning. So I may have a student or two there, I may have a group of students there, or I may have most of the students in my class at this level. And that helps me to determine, do I need to provide some one-on-one instruction, small group, or an entire class lesson out of my foundations materials, or provide a learning center, or do some one-on-one based on the data that I have from my students. And this is how the learning, or the construct progressions, can help guide my instruction. So how does using this help me to help my students? It provides a way to know where my students are and what they need next. So then what could I do in my classroom or in my teaching now that I know this? I have a lot of options around that depending on the curricular materials that I have and the resources that I have in my classroom. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to take notes in your booklet based on that Unit 1 task that you already do and how it aligns with the letter naming and fine motor grip and manipulation construct progression. So here is the grip and manipulation. So suppose you have a student who is using thumbs and fingers to manipulate objects, but when you watch them, they're doing a whole arm movement. But they have some increased stability from the shoulder, but you still notice that they're using their thumbs and fingers, like the pincer grip, but you notice they're doing a whole arm movement, that you see their elbow up in the air when they're riding. So they're not doing a shoulder roll, right? But they have their elbow up in the air when they're riding. We see our students do this all the time, right? So where might they be along this progression? And where is it that you want to support them to move next? So once you know where they are and where they need to move next, how does using this help me to help my students? And then what could I do now that I know this? So what the research tells us is we want to be really clear with students what the expectations are as we define that criteria for success. And we can do some really specific modeling for our students so that they know here's where they are and here's where we want them to move next. And this is just a piece of that progression as well. Let's take a look at another piece of the task that you are already doing. Here's another ELA Unit 1 task in your district. This one is around the citizen sort checklist. Here, students are expected to come together and do an activity around good citizen, not a good citizen. They can create pictures, they can select from pictures, and that activity, they can use a digital camera. The way you provide that activity for them is up to you. But one thing that it can align to on the construct progression for kindergarten entry is following directions. So there are a lot of expectations around this activity, and what you do is a citizen sort checklist. The other thing that you can be observing for is how well students are following directions. And one way that you can observe for this is to take pictures, notes, oral accounts as you match to the progression to interpret and adapt your instruction. So let's take a look at the progression together. So let's suppose students have their pictures, good citizen, not a good citizen, these behaviors that you're wanting them to sort in their small groups. And suppose you're asking them to put their picture under one category or another, and you're not giving them visual cues to do that. Place your picture under the category for good citizen. Place your picture under the category for not good citizen. And you want to see if they will follow that direction. You may also provide two-step directions. When you finish your picture, place it here. So that's a two-step direction. And you could provide visual cues or not provide visual cues, and you want to see where students will fall along this construct progression. And what this does for us is it allows us to know, is it the content or is it the oral processing of information? This is important for us to know because at times we may assume that students are not getting a concept when it's the language processing that they need support with. So we might try it with a visual cue, either by pointing or providing an icon type or a chart that shows them step by step what they need to do, to see if that is support that they need with the language in order to follow the instructions. So how does using this help me to help my students? Then what we are able to know is their level of language acquisition, regardless of the content that we're instructing. So if we're giving one-step directions, do our students need visual cues or not? When we're giving two-step directions, do our students need visual cues or not? And then it allows them to have the best opportunity to show us what they know. Let's try another one together. You have a Unit 1 ELA post-assessment using David Goes to School, where this book is read digitally to students. And then you have a post-assessment rubric that you use. That book is an excellent example where you could add a question or two to gauge students' level of emotional literacy in a non-graded way. So you could add a prompt or two around emotional literacy when using that post-assessment rubric. A checklist could be created, or notes or oral accounts could be used to match to the progression to interpret and adapt instruction. So this is a time you're already sitting with a student and asking them questions around a text. And simply by asking a couple of additional questions, you could gauge their emotional literacy. I put a couple of questions here just so you had an example of what I was thinking. So what questions might you add to elicit evidence of emotional literacy, looking at these two pictures? If you have someone with you as you're viewing this section of the professional development, you can turn and come up with a couple of questions together, or you can take a moment or two to just write a couple of questions. Here's just what a section of the emotional literacy construct progression looks like. So if you had asked, for example, using these pictures, what is the girl with the red in the picture, the red-headed girl with the pigtails, feeling in this picture, or even pointing to that? What is this girl feeling in this picture? What is David feeling in this picture? How do you think David feels in this picture? However you want to phrase that. And then you see how the child answers that question to be able to see how they're able to label emotions in others and see where they fall along that construct progression. And then you can probe for higher levels as well. So again, how does using this help me to help my students? Once you know where they are along the construct progression, then you know what the next step might be. If they're able to label, oh, here's where this child feels, I know that I'm feeling happy, that my friend is feeling sad, then you can move on to higher level emotions, that you can move on to cause and effect relationships with your students. Here's an example from the Math Unit 1 task that you are already doing. This is a really nice match to our object counting progression for kindergarten entry. And you may have already used this last year, that the student will understand the relationship between counting objects and arranged in various configurations. It's actually an exact match to the progression. And there's a nice task here, a performance task, involving a narrative using the PE teacher. And so again, you gather this data and then you match it to the construct progression. And this enables you to plan next instructional steps. So you're already eliciting this evidence, and your next step is to interpret it. So are they able to name or indicate the same number of objects without recounting? Can they do it when the objects are rearranged? So you find where they are along the construct progression, and then that allows you to provide whole group instruction as needed, individual, small group, depending on the kind of data that you're gathering and where students are along the progression. It helps to inform your instruction and provides you that next step, the learning status, and then the learning target for each of your students. So that, how does this help me? It provides you that here's where they are and here's the next step. And what could I do in my classroom? That allows you to group students for their instructional needs and allows you to see what mini lesson might I need, what guided reading or guided math might I provide, what students might need a little one-on-one around these skills. So there was one construct progression that we weren't able to match to using the formative data that Guilford teachers are already gathering, and that's engagement in self-selected activities. So take a look at that at a glance document that has the construct progression on it for engagement in self-selected activities, and think about, what do you already observe? And what evidence do you think you could elicit? What data do you gather that could help you to mark students along that progression to determine their current learning status in order to help your students move to the next step? Here's an example of that progression. These are things you probably know about your students already from watching them as they are engaging in their learning activities. You may have students who, when you assign an activity, are wandering around the room. This is about self-selected activities. So there may be times when you are providing time for students to select their learning activities. So when you do that, when they're allowed this free choice for learning activities, are they able to make a purposeful choice? So if they have an opportunity to select from 5 different things to do or 3 different things to do, are they able to make a purposeful choice and engage in an activity? Do they, A, wander, examining options and not able to settle on a choice? Are they begin to make a choice and then begin to sustain an engagement in a chosen activity? Do they sustain engagement in a self-selected activity, ignoring task irrelevant information and low-level distractions from peers? So if somebody comes up and starts to talk to me, am I going to be able to ignore that? Or am I going to, at every distraction, stop my work? So there are performance descriptors that can help you to see where your students might be along this progression. And this is during the classroom. So when there are self-selected activities available to your students during classroom activities, we want to know, what kind of decision makers are they? Are they able to make purposeful choices? So how does using this help me to help my students? And what could I do in my classroom now that I know this? What kind of modeling can you provide? How can you help your students to know what success looks like? Okay, so that's the end of this section, and the next section will begin daily routines and centers.